and the great majority of Russian army soldiers have experienced enormous hardships in their fight against Ukraine. As the Russian army supply shortages persisted, there was discussion of facing worse problems against Ukraine. When the soldiers taken prisoner in the operations heard about the high tensions in the Russian army, things began to change completely in Ukraine's favor. The admissions of captured Russian soldiers have taken the entire globe by surprise. However, it is now widely acknowledged that the Ukrainian army is superior, particularly intellectually. According to the information obtained by the Ukrainian army from the Russians, it ceased. Being a prisoner in the Ukrainian army is preferable to being a soldier in the Russian army. It is stated that getting ahead in the fight will be a miracle for the Russian army, which deploys outdated technology. Furthermore, it is discussed that the guns are not safe enough based on facts stated by Russian detainees that entrained people were forcibly conscripted, and all soldiers who were taken were given these dangerous weapons. According to reports, most troops were injured during training with these outdated weapons and were later discharged from the service as a result of their injuries. The captives, whose basic necessities are supplied even in the Ukrainian army, claim that the Russian army does not provide the same chances. This event demonstrates to the entire world how awful the Russian army is in a bad circumstance, and the comments made by war analysts in response to the current developments will astound the entire world. According to military observers, the Ukrainian army has made significant advances in recent days. Although the hell perceived appears to be the most essential cause for this mismanagement of the Russian army is also a major factor. Things will improve much more if a substantial percentage of Ukrainian soldiers believe they have now reached the point where they can take actions to entirely evict Russia. As a result, it was widely assumed that matters had entirely shifted in Ukraine's favor, owing to the fact that Ukraine had long since taken the lead against the Russians. The Ukrainian army, on the other hand, has begun to demonstrate that it has risen to a superior position as a result of these recent developments. Following that, Zelensky's words indicate that this occupation will be entirely dismantled in a short period of time. In recent pronouncements, Zelensky has stated that Ukraine will retake Crimea in a short period of time. This situation has begun to demonstrate how far Ukraine has advanced over Russia, both conceptually and qualitatively, and it is unclear how Russia will react today. If the Ukrainian army maintains its position as a result of recent developments, it will be able to declare its advance in all areas. And with that, he will now be able to demonstrate that the Ukrainian army has a significant edge over the Russians in a short period of time. But it is a truth that Putin began his career on this road, and it has also been revealed that he has done a lot of damage to his career because the Ukrainian army has conducted numerous operations based on the advance. It is no longer known what the Russians would do. And to add to the obscurity, there is discussion that Putin should step down from his seat. Now, if the Russian military is treated in this manner, Putin is anticipated to undertake a number of much more favorable measures very soon. And while Putin is now attempting to make more serious threats against Ukraine, he is well aware that if these operations fail, he will be forced to leave. And with this departure, Russia enters a period of serious political turmoil. Thousands of Russian soldiers have started switching sides and joining the pro-Ukrainian Russian Legion of Freedom troops after Vladimir Putin's decision to capture Sergei Surovikin. Russian soldiers loyal to Surovikin began to switch sides. Russian soldiers who began to cooperate with the pro-Ukrainian soldiers of the Russian Legion of Freedom fighting within the city limits of Belgorod, Russia have taken control of 2 more different Russian towns in the city of Belgorod. While Vladimir Putin is shaken by this stunning news, the International Criminal Court has taken action again to punish Vladimir Putin. The judicial process has been launched for the Russian leader after it was revealed that Vladimir Putin used a large majority of the state treasury for the Wagner mercenary company. While the war between Russia and Ukraine continues, the internal decadence within the borders of Russia continues to shake the agenda of the whole world. The news of the betrayal of Russian General Sergei Surovikin, known as one of Vladimir Putin's most loyal men, shook the Kremlin administration. Bad news began to come repeatedly after Wagner commander Yevgeny Prigozhin attempted a coup in Russia. While the whole world was thinking about how Wagner's soldiers had captured the Russian cities of Rostov and Voronezh so easily, the true extent of the business was revealed later. As is known, when Wagner's soldiers entered the territory of Russia, no one suspected that there was a coup. However, after taking control of the Russian military building in Rostov, Yevgeny Prigozhin stated that it was clearly a coup. However, there was a different incident that attracted attention when Wagner's soldiers captured these two cities. Although there were a lot of Russian soldiers in these cities, no intervention was made against Wagner's army. The Russian soldiers stationed here were content just to watch the Wagner soldiers entering the cities. These soldiers, who fought on the territory of Ukraine voluntarily at the request of Sergei Surovikin, lost their respect for Putin after Surovikin was dismissed. Now Putin's issuing a warrant for Surovikin's arrest has become the last point that has worn out the patience of Surovikin's loyal soldiers. These soldiers, who were stationed in the city of Rostov, preferred to watch rather than intervene when Wagner's soldiers entered the city. At the same time, it was determined that the soldiers who handed over the Russian military building, which the Wagner army had captured in the city of Rostov, to the Wagner leader Prigozhin with their own hands, were Surovikin's soldiers. After that, theories began to be created about why Russian General Sergei Surovikin betrayed. But the real interesting event began after the betrayal of Surovikin's soldiers. The chief of the Russian General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, decided to completely close the unit to which these soldiers were attached due to the fact that these soldiers stationed in the cities of Rostov and Voronezh did not intervene at all. He also stated that the soldiers who served together with these will be tried by the Russian judiciary. However, this situation led to the further exasperation of Surovikin's soldiers. Now, Sergei Surovikin's soldiers have left the Russian army and started joining the Ukrainian army. In recent weeks, soldiers of the pro-Ukrainian Russian Freedom Legion have managed to enter Russia's borders and capture the border towns of Belgorod The seizure of territory within the borders of Russia by the Ukrainian army, which has taken control of 3 different towns, has made a big noise on the whole world agenda. However, according to information learned later, the soldiers of the Russian Freedom Legion did not consist only of Ukrainian soldiers. Surovikin's soldiers, who refused to fight for Vladimir Putin after the arrest warrant issued to Sergei Surovikin and the allegations that Surovikin would be arrested, joined the Russian Freedom Legion soldiers at the Belgorod border, as it is known. The soldiers of the Russian Freedom Legion are composed of Russian soldiers, although they are pro-Ukrainian. These soldiers, who think that the Putin regime is coming to an end and that Putin is the biggest trouble that has ever happened to Russia, are fighting to dethrone Putin from his throne. Surovikin's loyal soldiers began to side with the soldiers of the Russian Legion of Freedom because they felt betrayed by Putin. Recently, soldiers of the Russian Freedom Legion issued a declaration that they had captured the town of Zaborovska. According to information obtained from regional sources, Surovikin's soldiers have already participated in this operation. The soldiers of the Russian Legion of Freedom and Russian soldiers are trying to take revenge on Putin by organizing military operations within the borders of Russia. How Surovikin and Putin, who have very close relations, could suddenly become such enemies? A question mark remained on everyone's minds, however. According to many war analysts, Surovikin's rapid increase in power began to make Vladimir Putin very nervous. And for this reason, Putin took action to neutralize Surovikin. A few weeks after being appointed by Putin, Surovikin unexpectedly formed his own troops. Together with these soldiers, he carried out air strikes against several Ukrainian cities, especially Kiev. Sergei Surovikin managed to gain the respect of the Russian soldiers to a great extent as a result of the attacks he organized on the territory of Ukraine. Surovikin, who gained power very quickly within the army, managed to eliminate Putin by taking control of the entire army in a short time. However, this situation made Vladimir Putin very uncomfortable. At that time, there were a lot of protests taking place within the borders of Russia. The Russian people were taking to the streets in many cities of Russia to organize anti-Putin demonstrations for the end of the war and the Putin regime. Vladimir Putin, on the other hand, considered it a threat to him that a name like Surovikin would gain so much power in such a situation. Because if any coup attempt was made, Russian General Sergei Surovikin could be in the first place among the names who would lead this codex. Thus, Surovikin was dismissed very quickly and replaced by the Russian general, Valery Gerasimov. Surovikin was quite angry with Putin for being dismissed. In a statement made after his dismissal, he targeted Putin, stating that he had done and would do everything for Russia and the Russian military. But despite this, he had been betrayed by some names. The dismissed Surovikin has now become an open target within the United States. Surovikin would have faced a prison sentence if he had been tried at the international criminal courts for war crimes he had committed. While the whole of Russia was shaken by the news of Surovikin's betrayal, as it turned out that Vladimir Putin was using the state treasury for his own interests when the war between Russia and Ukraine started. The rapid decaying of the money in the Russian state treasury attracted the attention of Russian government officials. However, Putin did not dwell much on this issue and prevented this incident from being reflected in the media. After Wagner's army attempted a coup in Russia and Yevgeny Prigozhin decried the betrayal, secret agreements signed between Wagner and Putin were revealed. The statements of Russian lawmakers, who are opponents of Vladimir Putin, managed to shock everyone. Putin announced a decision on partial mobilization and forcibly sent nearly 300,000 Russian citizens to the territory of Ukraine by recruiting them into the army. Putin, who thought that he could accelerate the invasion of Ukrainian territory with more troops, was quite mistaken about this. These soldiers who did not have any experience of the war and were not well trained could not achieve the success they wanted on the territory of Ukraine. Realizing that the Russian army was starting to lose strength, Putin made a deal with Prigozhin. Wagner promised his army and Prigozhin a lot of growth, important sources of income, such as underground resources and industrial factories in the areas that Wagner's army had captured on Ukrainian territory were to be given to Prigozhin. However, the biggest scandal was that Vladimir Putin fed Wagner by using money from the state treasury for his own interests. Putin was using the state treasury to pay the salaries of Wagner soldiers fighting on the territory of Ukraine. At the same time, the Wagner soldiers' need for weapons and ammunition was also used from the state treasury. However, all the needs of the Wagner soldiers had to be met by the Wagner mercenary company. Upon learning about this, Russian opposition officials submitted a motion in parliament to investigate state treasury spending. However, this motion was rejected because the parliamentary majority was in favor of Putin. However, with the spread of this situation in Russia, the international criminal courts took action, stating that it is forbidden for a government to support a different organization other than its own army. The officials of the International Criminal Court decided that Vladimir Putin should be tried on this issue. As it is known, the International Criminal Court previously decided to arrest Putin on the grounds that he forcibly took Ukrainian citizens on Ukrainian territory to Russia and committed war crimes on Ukrainian territory. But despite all this, Putin still continues to commit war crimes. The fact that the war suddenly spilled over into Russia's borders and the soldiers of the Russian Legion of Freedom began to advance on Russian territory began to scare Vladimir Putin quite a lot. Putin, who first decided to increase security measures in the city of Belgrade, began to deploy a large number of Russian soldiers to Belgrade. At the same time, Russian citizens living in the border towns of Belgorod were asked to leave these towns and settle in safer areas. The slow progress of the soldiers of the Russian Legion of Freedom has started to make the Kremlin very nervous. Putin decided to cancel mass events planned for the coming days because he was afraid that these pro-Ukrainian soldiers would launch an airstrike. It was decided that the aviation military industry events that Putin organizes every year will not be held this year. The Wagner army gaining so much power within the borders of Russia has not only scared Vladimir Putin. Due to the fact that Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko has taken Wagner leader Yevgeny Prigozhin under protection and the vast majority of Wagner soldiers have settled within the borders of Belarus. The Polish government has also begun to make moves to increase border security. Surprised that Wagner's army could attempt such a major coup even in Russia, the Polish government announced that Wagner was a major threat to Poland. Thus, Polish Interior Minister Mariusz Kaminski stated that the alliance of Lukashenko and Wagner is a great threat to Poland. Polish Interior Minister Kaminski has decided to send 5,000 border guards, 2,000 soldiers, and 500 highly trained Med officers to Poland's border with Belarus. This move by the Polish government was also a message to Putin. Missiles sent by the Russian army many times before exploded within the borders of Poland. These missiles, which damaged some buildings and structures in Poland, greatly angered the Polish government. Russian leader Vladimir Putin stated that the coordinates of these missiles were miscalculated and sent to Poland by mistake. However, the fact that this incident took place a few days after Poland announced a military support package for Ukraine made Putin think that these statements were lies. As it is known, Poland is leading the list of countries that support Ukraine, both militarily and financially. The Polish government first decertified the visa agreement between it and Ukraine, allowing Ukrainian citizens to enter Poland without any documents. Later, Poland, which provided financial resources assistance for Ukrainian citizens, paid many Ukrainian citizens. Poland, which also provides military equipment support to the Ukrainian army, has agreed to send a large number of weapons and ammunition. However, his biggest support was to send German-made Leopard tanks to the Ukrainian army. Poland, which has stated that tank assistance should be provided to Ukraine since the beginning of the war, could not send these tanks to Ukraine because the tanks it used were German-made and it could not get permission from Germany. However, shortly after the US sent Abrams tanks to Ukraine, Germany agreed to send Leopard tanks to Ukraine. Thus, there were no obstacles left in front of Poland, and it sent a large number of Leopard tanks to the Ukrainian army. This move by Poland has greatly damaged its relations with both Russia and Belarus. Now, the fact that Wagner's army is located within the borders of Belarus opens up the possibility of starting a new war with Poland. For this reason, the Polish army has begun to greatly increase security measures on the border with Belarus. While the war's ferocity has reached Russian nerves, the Ukrainian army has begun to plan large-scale operations against Russian soldiers in order to turn this crisis into an opportunity. The Russian army has once again been surrounded by Ukrainian soldiers. Russian forces were forced to surrender fully during Ukraine's large-scale assault in Luhansk. The action effectively terminated the Russian army's grip in Luhansk. Ukrainian army continued to reclaim captured territory one by one. The Russian army on the other side suffered a significant defeat in the Ukrainian organized operation. The notion that Russian President Vladimir Putin is down to his final trump cards continues to rock the world with the latest bride scenario. Russia is still going through some turbulent times. The Ukraine forces' consistent wins as well as their consistent ascent inspire Russian soldiers to despair. The Ukrainian forces' victories in this battle, which is closely monitored by many countries and is only minimally involved because the Russian soldiers to emotionally degenerate the Russian soldiers who are already fighting against their will are causing the army to deteriorate day by day. In addition to the negative experiences they have had, Russian soldiers who frequently encountered Putin's harsh and authoritarian attitude began to hunt for an escape path within the army. While reports of army desertions continued to rise, Putin has begun to implement ever more restrictive and stringent procedures in order to retain soldiers in the army. Regardless of how severe Putin's policies become, soldiers in the Russian army are beginning to desert one by one. Russian soldiers who have witnessed the deaths of soldiers who were drafted into the army one by one, like themselves, do not want to end up like these soldiers as a result, although knowing that they would be shot if they were found. The soldiers began to sacrifice everything in order to flee the army without thinking about anything. The problems seen within the Russian army do not stop there. In addition to other issues, the Russian government's incapacity to meet the needs of the military in any way continues to cause problems. Nobody could have expected that Russia's administration would get this far into the war. As a result, no discussion was held regarding how to intervene in the army's problems. The challenges for which no solutions have been found are becoming more severe by the day. This kind of financial difficulty has also disturbed the required maintenance of soldiers, which cannot be felt. The soldiers not only strengthened their grip on military equipment and ammunition, but they also went much further and are also suffering from food shortages. Soldiers who are unable to feed themselves are also unable to receive critical medical attention. Many infectious diseases began to manifest themselves in the army as a result of this lack of care. Despite these significant issues within the military, Russian President Vladimir Putin continues to compel many soldiers to join the army on a daily basis. On the one hand, the Ukrainian army's incoming and outgoing support continues to grow its forces without interruption. In addition to the various issues that the Russian army is experiencing, such a reinforcement of Ukrainian forces has begun to create tremendous concern in the Russian administration because of this widespread panic within the Russian government. Russian President Vladimir Putin, who is constantly experimenting with new methods and ideas, continues to fail and generate significant challenges for the army. Ukrainian forces have begun to push through crucial locations in order to exploit the tremendous disarray atmosphere within the army and in Russia. In this way, Ukrainian forces focusing on the Luhansk region identified Russian forces' weakness in the region. The army that acted on this determination scored one of the region's most significant wins. Russia, on the other hand, has made hurried judgments in order to terminate the war as soon as possible. One of these rash judgments was to concentrate on the cities of Bakhmut and Soledar, seizing these areas as soon as possible and pushing to Kiev. However, Russia has rendered the territories it controls in this manner entirely defenseless. Ukrainian soldiers took action after becoming aware of the situation. The Russian army, which was short on soldiers, dispatched a large number of troops to the Luhansk region in order to seize control of the cities of Bakhmut and Soledar. As a result, the protection of this location, which is a very powerful territory from the standpoint of Russian troops, has been substantially diminished. Urkna soldiers, sensing an opportunity, devised a major strategy and advanced to this location with a massive force. According to intelligence gathered from within the Russian army, the Ukrainian soldiers that intervened proceeded very cautiously in the region, leaving the Russian troops with little way to defend themselves. Ukrainian forces launched a series of modest operations to anger Russia's army, which is suffering from military incompetence in the Luhansk region. They went on the defense, firing fire on small-scale strikes coordinated by Ukrainian forces without knowing the major goal of these attacks. The Russian soldiers, on the other hand, took great care to keep these defenses to a minimum. The primary reason for this was that they misjudged the strength of Ukrainian forces and did not regard the impending onslaught as a serious danger to their detriment. The Ukrainian forces used the Russian soldiers' advance to their advantage. The Urkina forces, who acted in ways that demonstrated their actual strength to the rest of the world, ensured that the Russian army suffered a significant setback. The Russian headquarters in the region were identified one by one, and these headquarters were shelled in an instant, startling the Russian forces. Russian soldiers were absolutely defenseless against incoming missiles since they had not expected such a large offensive from Ukrainian forces. The Ukrainian army has given the Russian army a second shock by organizing a considerably larger onslaught than the strikes that were unexpectedly arranged. On top of all of this, Ukrainian forces deploying HIMARS in the Luhansk region posed a significant threat to the unprotected Russian soldiers. The Russian soldiers, who were utterly unprepared for such an attack when the missiles were activated, had no idea what to do in the face of this attack. After a while, the Russian soldiers, who had been crushed by the blows inflicted by the Ukrainian army one by one, were compelled to surrender totally to the Ukrainian forces. Despite the fact that a handful of soldiers remained to struggle with Ukrainian forces, the Russian army was able to completely neutralize these soldiers in a short period of time and rid the region of the occupying Russian forces. As a result, the Ukrainian forces that have taken control of the region have delivered a significant blow to the Russian forces during the fight. Ukrainian forces who refused to allow the Russian army to intervene with tanks used armor-piercing guns to blow up the Russian tanks one by one. The Russian army, which is low on armored vehicles, has run into a major problem with the total destruction of tanks. Russian soldiers who suffered crushing setbacks against Ukrainian forces in numerous missions became acutely aware of the economic crisis. Russia, which struggles to make enough investments in the military sector, forces its soldiers to fight with obsolete weapons. This economic crisis, which is not limited to the army, has begun to have a significant impact on the Russian people. Russian residents who are struggling to satisfy their basic requirements, such as those in the army, are calling for the war to be ended completely. People who are sick and weary of Putin's war on personal demands have taken to the streets and begun organizing anti-Putin and anti-war protests, according to military strategists. If Russia continues to be defeated in this manner, the country may be destroyed in a short amount of time. Another operation was conducted against Russian tanks, which Putin frequently praises. The Russian army has received a divine blow. A big Russian tank unit attempting to strike Ukraine has become bogged down in mud. The Russian forces who needed reinforcements in this area were in for a great surprise. Ukrainian unmanned aerial vehicles monitoring the area discovered the tank regiment immersed in mud. And it was this bombardment that changed the trajectory of the war. Russia during the recent Ukrainian war, the Russian army chose a radically different approach. Putin made a huge error when he decided to send his tanks to the Ukrainian territory. Putin faced something he never imagined in the Ukrainian region, where seasonal issues are fairly serious. The fact that the Russian army was demoralized owing to the issues it was encountering also made this trouble happen. But all of Putin's intentions were thwarted by this final step. The Russian army was unable to meet the need for resupply on all fronts in Ukraine. This circumstance assured that the Russian soldiers were unable to defend adequately. As a result, the Ukrainian army was able to take far larger moves against the Russians. Putin's failure to respond to these questions has drawn widespread notice. Putin has recently begun producing propaganda using just Russian media. The most notable of these propaganda claimed that the tanks sent to reinforce the Ukrainian army were of poor quality. Putin has consistently made adverts stating that the tanks owned by the Russian army are considerably better. However, this enabled us to tackle a major challenge while fighting the Russians. The Ukrainian army began to rely heavily on tanks. This put the Russian soldiers in a precarious situation, and the Russian army's tanks were the only significant solution against the Ukrainian army. When Putin mentioned how excellent these tanks were in his propaganda efforts, the anticipation skyrocketed. As a result, the Russian army decided to send a substantial portion of its tanks to Bakhmut. Ukrainian intelligence, which had been made aware of the occurrence in advance, had begun planning. However, because it was unclear which route to take to Bakhmut, the Ukrainian army opted to deploy unmanned aerial vehicles, and he began to have these unmanned aerial vehicles continually monitor Bakhmut. Exactly. At this point, the Ukrainian army was informed of a major development and the Russian tanks are fully surrounded at this time. The Ukrainian army has determined the route of the Russian convoy. A surprising development confronted the Russian tanks at this particular moment. Last spring was very rainy and the route to Bakhmut was entirely muddy. Although the tank regiment commander stated that it was difficult for tanks that were not acclimated to this situation to make the shift, the Kremlin's directive was quite different. The Russian 72s, which had left on Putin's orders, had to stay on the road for a little longer. This circumstance has thoroughly perplexed matters. The Russian army's tanks couldn't get out of the muck. These tanks, which will transport a critical load to Bakhmut, have to make their way there. He had made all of the arrangements for the army in Bakhmut who were waiting for reinforcements. Ukraine and unmanned aerial vehicles were seen in the skies at the time, although the Russian forces who witnessed this attempted to remain unseen. The unmanned aerial vehicles that approached the low height noticed the Russian army waiting for assistance, and things have entirely shifted in Ukraine's favor. The Ukrainian army promptly demanded that the unmanned aerial vehicle be reinforced. The Russian army's reinforcements had not yet arrived in this location. The Ukrainian army has begun shelling tanks. Russian soldiers began fleeing by abandoning their tanks. In this location, the Ukrainian army destroyed tanks. The Ukrainian army then attacked the armored vehicles dispatched by Russian forces to retrieve the tanks, putting a major crimp in Putin's plans in Bakhmut. And as a result of this development, the Russian army has found itself in a very tough situation against Ukraine. The Russian soldiers were at a loss for what to do after this setback. A significant number of people instantly began moving towards Bakhmut to fight Ukraine. As a result of this predicament, Russian soldiers are now facing even greater problems. On the trip, the Russian soldiers who were also subjected to Ukrainian army harassment bullets suffered a severe psychological breakdown until they arrived at Bakhmut. However, the Ukrainian army has just begun to take a more substantial role in Bakhmut. The Russian army was extremely tense since the expected resupply did not arrive. The Russian army's mobilization began to increase gradually. This predicament occurred on top of a period of mental collapse caused by defeats against the Ukrainian army.